Hello, and welcome back to Zenin Fanfics. Today we're starting part 40 of an exciting series. What if Villain Deku became a teacher at U.A? If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more content. The story we're featuring is written by Bloomer Bill on fanfiction.net. You can find all the relevant links in the description, so be sure to check out the author's profile and say hello. Now let's dive into the story. Tomura sighed, running his thumb over one of the keys hidden in his pockets. Today was supposed to be fun. He didn't get to do many main story quests with Sensei since he got hit by All Might surprise raid, so he was very excited to see him. But he was bored. Painfully bored. He'd left his devices at home since he wanted to go back into the main quest without any distractions, something that made his grinding more productive in his sessions with Deku. He went through Giri's portal and found himself in the small living area that he'd come to know as where Sensei had been staying. Sensei sitting on the special chair the doctor made for him that held all of the life boosters he needed. Going there was an experience. For some reason, the house felt much less welcoming, which he didn't quite understand since the area's graphics weren't that different from Giri's bar. Tomura tried to shake it off as that weirdness he felt when he returned to his older games and couldn't remember anything about the map and his higher perception and intelligence levels adding to the odd air of the place. However, the quest was for lore gathering, it seems. Sensei had wanted him to watch the annual special event with him, though it was clearly a perception check since he wanted Tomura to describe the events for him, which wasn't a bad quest all things considered, just a touch dull all things considered. However, made sure not to voice this thought since he was probably still only in the beginning of the main quest storyline and had just done a lot of grinding on Deku's side story. So, Tomura settled in and took out his lore-keeping book and flipped it open to a blank page. Tomura, what is that in your hands? Sensei asked, confusing Tomura for a second until he recalled Sensei and him hadn't spoken beyond quick check-ins to maintain their relationship level. So, Sensei hadn't known about his leveling up, updated skills, and new inventory items. It's my lore-keeping book, Grinzilla suggested, keeping one for Noir's Island, and I've found it useful for other things too. Tomura answered easily enough, since it was true. They had been going for some of the harder quests in Nori's Island that he couldn't take without a party before, and keeping a physical book of the things he needed to do was easier to keep track with. And sure, he was probably more open to the idea since Deku was also constantly writing in his own books, but Grinzilla was the one that prompted the idea. Sensei hummed, tapping one of his fingers on his cheek from the hand he held his face in. I see. How insightful of you, Tomura. Sensei replied after a moment. Tomura pursed his lips, his brows furrowing. Sensei's reaction was not what Tomura expected, and Tomura felt somewhat disappointed by it. Perhaps his perception wasn't at a high enough level yet, but for some reason Sensei didn't seem to be that happy or impressed by him starting to keep records. Deku, on the other hand, praised him for his initiative and rewarded him with the current set of gloves he was sporting, ones that had a plus 12 dexterity and the normal quirk debuff that kept him from destroying everything he touched. And maybe it was just the lag, but Sensei's words felt patronizing somehow. But Sensei wasn't doing that surely. It had to be some kind of feedback from the rebreather he was wearing that caused his dialogue to come out wrong. Tomura turned the TV on, already set to the right channel, and the cartoonish weight screen bobbing cheerfully and stating that they would be watching the first-year festival in a few seconds. Then they were greeted by the narrators of the event. There were always two, and the first was a constant. Present Mike was a touch too hyper for him, but Deku was right. He was a good NPC, making white noise to grind too. Hawks, though, was a surprising second narrator, but he was looking forward to getting more data points on this hero. There was the average generation of random student NPCs, none of them really catching his eye, but the second hero class was only 3 characters, and Tomura wondered if they would be stronger than the average student mob. But when Deku was introduced, next Tomura nearly dropped his pencil from how startled he was. Ah, the famous Deku-Sensei. I've heard so much about. What an unexpected twist. Tomura. Sensei commented. Tomura swallowed, then said, the DM role is a great way to see this NPC's alignment leanings, hoping that it would be the right choice to keep any suspicions at bay. Sensei hummed again, and Tomura guessed that was the best outcome he could have hoped for. He really didn't want Sensei to know about Deku, and didn't want to hint even accidentally about encountering Deku. And there was the uncomfortable crawling of his skin as he was forced to once again acknowledge that Sensei would probably get rid of Deku as soon as he could. A fact that he found harder and harder to swallow each time he thought of it. So instead, he focused on the lack of reaction from the crowd because he could feel comfortably angry at those heroes that were ghosting Deku IRL. But then the NPC from the hero class stepped up, and due to the mix of random events lining up, just right got one of the rarest cutscenes with an NPCs that had a chaotic lawful alignment, as she called out the heroes. Tomura couldn't help being endeared to the NPC as she went out of her way to defend Deku from the heroes. One that could see the bullshit and call it out was a rare thing to find in the heroes. Deku had said there would be some true paragons in the bunch of NPCs, and it looked like he was strong at work reinforcing their minds. Before he could revel in the NPC's dialogue, though, Sensei gave a displeased hum, and Tomura glanced back at Sensei, a touch wary. "That girl shall be a problem," Sensei said, and Tomura's brows furrowed again. "What do you mean, Sensei?" Tomura asked, and Sensei chuckled, reaching out a hand to ruffle his hair. Instead of the expected warmth that anyways came from the action before now, and Tomura's stomach twisted. Characters like that Tomura tend to be outspoken, and they always cause us problems. Better to snuff them out before they leave the ground and have a following of like-minded people. Sensei explained to him. "What kind of problems?" Tomura asked. He already had an inkling, but thinking about it made his guts churn. Sensei threw a grin his way, one that held more teeth than Tomura remembered. "Don't worry about it, Tomura. I'll smooth away any wrinkles she causes. Just pay attention to the screen," Sensei told him. It was much harder to brush off how condescending that line from Sensei was. Tomura did as Sensei asked, though, and turned back to the screen and watched the NPCs carefully, noting the characters weren't using their full move pool, but was able to know what the rest of it was. Deku had taught him how to read the motions enemies went through, and if his fighting record was anything to go by, then he'd gotten very good at battlefield predictions. And that made it even easier to figure out good strategies with and against certain quirks in the short time they were on screen, how useful they were overall. This year was noticeably less harmful to the students, most likely because Deku set a much lower damage field for the students than the other DMs, something that unsurprisingly disappointed the heroes in the background. Sensei had always called the sports festival a legalized BLD match. But even though Sensei said this was a show of how depraved people had become, he too seemed to be disappointed with the lack of bloodlust the students had and that they weren't actively using their quirks. It isn't long before the festival ended, and Sensei shooed him away so he could talk with the doctor about something. As Tomura walked out of the room feeling like a child sent to his room. Then he exited the hall. He was greeted by the rest of the facility, which was clearly more suited for the doctor's experiments. Something he normally wasn't hung up by, but recently it seemed he found a newfound discomfort with the idea. Looking down, he saw one of the doctor's Nomu summons hopping along its way. It was no bigger than a corgi, with purple skin and 6 eyes surrounding the exposed brain and a foot-long tongue hanging out of its mouth, dragging on the floor underneath it. Tomura knew that the size of the Nomu usually hinted at the age of the person used in the creation of the Nomu, and that the small Nomu was most likely a very young child before the doctor got a hold of them. The image of a child being twisted into the animal like Nomu, it was now made his guts twist, and Tomura swallowed, turning away from the Nomu and walked down the hall quicker, ending up in the labyrinth of Nomu and cages, which wasn't helping him avoid the uncomfortable thoughts of Sensei and his doctor warping children. So he tried to think of something else, and opened his lore books, flipping through the pages of his writing, the occasional drawing and doodle accompanying his notes, until he came to one of his earlier drawings of Deku as a game character. Tomura felt his stomach drop, and immediately closed the book, warily glancing around to see if anyone could have seen his book. He couldn't believe he'd been foolish enough to take one of the books that had Deku in them to where Sensei was. A croaking groan drew his attention, and Tomura saw a turtle-like Nomu, and a thought occurred to him and turned to his hand. Maybe he could try and touch a Nomu. Most of them used to be quirkless, and he might still be able to touch them. He cautiously approached the caged Nomu and removed one of his gloves, then reached forward, hesitating slightly with his hand hovering over the Nomu's head. Then he lowered his hand, and the Nomu's flesh remained as it was, scales and skin different from Deku's own, but still intact. With his hitched breath, Tomura felt relief as he stroked the Nomu's head. Its groaning quieted down. The knowledge that even if Deku was turned into a Nomu, he'd be able to still play with Deku's hair without the boy falling apart from his quirk was one of great relief. Maybe quirkless ally was a trainable skill, and all of his physical interaction with Deku had leveled the skill up so that he could also touch Nomu without hurting them now. Stepping away, Tomura saw another Nomu with a thick furry coat, and he wanted to feel that one too, placing his hand on the neck of the horse like Nomu. But this time he felt give as the Nomu's flesh gave way, and he quickly pulled his hand back, finding it wet with BLD. Disbelief flooded Tomura. He turned back to the Nomu and saw the hand-shaped spot slowly healing, overproving that his quirk worked on this Nomu. But why? Why did one Nomu fall apart and the other didn't? Tomura could count at least 4 quirks in both of the Nomu, so they both were made from the quirkless, and therefore they should have both fallen under the safety of his debuff, right? He racked his mind, looking for an answer, until he remembered that Nomu were a created race and not a natural one, and there were 2 ways to make Nomu, either directly by Sensei or by a gene treatment by the doctor. Perhaps that made them into 2 subclasses of Nomu, one that was protected by his debuff and the other that wasn't. The only question was which of the 2 was safe, Sensei's Nomu or the doctor's. A ring from his forgotten phone broke Tomura out of his thoughts. Tomura wiped the BLD off of his hand and answered the call, the ringtone being that of Grinzilla. Someone must be dying if you're calling me. Tomura tried to joke. Grinzilla usually texted him after all. The silence on the other end made him pause. Zilla, Tomura called after a minute. Chase, can you come meet me? Right now? Grinzilla asked, a seriousness to his tone that peeled away Tomura's previous humor. Yeah, what's up? Tomura questioned. It's about Miles. I'll text you my location. Just get here as soon as you can. Grinzilla told him before hanging up on him. Miles. Tomura thought, his heart skipping a beat. A ding from his phone showed he got the text from Grinzilla, and Tomura read it quickly before calling up Giri for a portal. Sensei had already dismissed him, and his party needed him. Tomura, after stepping through the portal, found himself in an alley, and he looked around scanning the area until he saw Grinzilla with Miles sitting beside him. Grinzilla was busy trying to comfort Miles, who was crying and sniffing. Tomura's guard was raised, and he crossed the distance, protectiveness surging through him. Why was Miles crying? Who thought they could make him cry? Grinzilla heard him coming and looked over to him, a touch pained but mostly tired looking as he greeted him. Chase. Miles's head came up just as Tomura stood in front of the boy. Miles, for the most part, looked all right, bar the tears and little snot from his crying, damp hair, and the clothes that were a little big on him. What happened? Tomura demanded. When neither of them answered, he repeated his demand. What happened? Miles bowed his head and began to recount what had happened to him. Mashireo had been forced to stay behind after that morning's practice to clean the dojo up, something that had become solely his job after the new MSTR had taken over, which he had done without complaint. He'd left the showers for last since he normally showered after he was done, so he didn't have to go home sweaty and tacky feeling. But when Mashireo left the shower, he couldn't find his towel and his stomach dropped. He'd heard of stories like this where students would steal the clothes of kids in the locker room at the school, but those were just stories, right? Mashireo searched the bathroom, trying to convince himself he must have just misplaced his towels, and that he definitely would have heard it if one of the other students had gone into the bathroom with him. He couldn't find them, and his stomach dropped. Panicking somewhat, he tried to find his clothes. It would be uncomfortable, but it was spring, and he wouldn't catch a cold from the walk home. But couldn't find his bag either. Dripping wet and shivering, Mashireo had no other option but to leave the locker room without anything on to look for his things. Wrapping his tail around himself in a small attempt to cover himself, and walked out of the locker room and saw the dojo was empty, so the biggest fear of his that the others would be recording him wasn't true. Mashireo tried very strong to find his clothes or one of his towels so he can cover up some, but found nothing. His heart slipping further from his chest, hesitantly looks outside, trying his best to keep it so his current state wouldn't be visible outside, and saw with horror that all of his clothes were torn apart and scattered on the sidewalk in front of the dojo, his other things smashed or wrecked on the ground as well, his phone included. Masahiro had no idea what to do in that moment. He was cold and naked, shivering from the recent shower, and probably no way to get anyone to help him. Masahiro searched around for anything he could use, a spare GI, or maybe even a towel just so he wasn't naked. But there was nothing. The only place he hadn't checked was the sensei's office, and he hated the thought of doing this, but he was desperate. He mentally apologized to his old sensei, and then used his tail to break the door down. With it being just what he was able to break in, and though he didn't find any clothes, he did find a landline that his old sensei liked, and rushed to grab and call someone. Only to pause because he didn't want to call his parents. This whole thing made him feel horrid, and couldn't even think he could actually explain everything to either of his parents from how ashamed he was. He floundered for a moment trying to think of someone else to call until he called up Shuichi, feeling less bad about calling his friend instead of his family for whatever reason. And by some miracle, Shuichi answered the random number, and he was able to explain what had happened to him. Shuichi then came to his rescue, rushing from wherever he was and bringing him a set of clothes that didn't quite fit but would let him be decent. After which Shuichi helped him try and gather up Masahirio's things, or what was left of them, only to find the remains of his phone, shattered and somehow snapped in half. At which point he burst into tears, and Shuichi led him into a back alley to not become a spectacle of himself. And I guess that's when Shuichi called you? Miles finished, clearly still very broken up about all of this, and when Tomura looked down to Miles's hands and indeed saw two beyond ruined halves of the old flip phone Miles had. Tomura remained silent for a moment, just processing the whole event Miles was jumped with. Grinzilla tried to rub Miles's back, a soft, comforting chirr coming from him. I can definitely recover the data off of your phone, Miles. And don't worry about the cost, okay? Chase can probably afford to buy you a dozen of them. Grinzilla promised. Miles began crying harder, and he sharply inhaled, kind of choking on it. I don't want to have a new phone. This phone was my Aji-san's. It was the last thing he gave me, and he remade it just for me from parts he bought, and Miles told them before he just started sobbing. Grinzilla, understanding how he fumbled, quickly hugged Miles, letting him sob into his chest, Grinzilla looking up to him lost and unsure what to do now. Tomura, meanwhile, was trembling from his anger. F it. Tomura turned on his heel and stormed off, ignoring Grinzilla's calling for him. Remembering that Grinzilla and Miles said they came into an alley nearby the dojo, and he scanned the streets. It wasn't strong to find what he was looking for, and he indeed saw the torn cloth and ripped up books, and his sight went red. Anger was such a familiar feeling, it easily rolled over him, comforting even as he walked over to the door and went inside, and he had to hold back from ripping off his gloves and destroying the whole damn building. He would have been very justified to burn the place down. Deku would probably bring him the gasoline to do it if he called him up right now about this CRP. But he used the calm that Deku taught him to remember that there was a worse thing to do that would ruin each and every one of those little shits. He made his way to the office, smirking at the wrecked wooden door, very proud of his little fox's ability to break things down. Tomura walked over to the desk and began going through the desk's drawers looking for the student records, finding them with a great deal of ease. Well, slime balls never had a lot of intelligence points, and he got out his phone and began taking screenshots of all of the names and phone numbers. Then he turned to the safe. He glared at it for a moment, then removed one of his gloves and used his quirk to open the safe and looted it. Partially mollified with what he managed to do, he turned back around and walked out of the building. He wanted to do so much more, but Deku had taught him the value of patience in matters like this. But if those 8-bit NPCs wanted to F with one of his party members, then Tomura would teach them exactly how badly they screwed up. He'd make sure that they regretted ever looking in Miles' direction. Tomura made his way back to his party and put his gloves back on, Grinzilla looking at him warily, but he brushed it off, and Tomura grabbed Miles by the arm. Come on, Kit, we got a new fetch quest to do now, Tomura stated, Miles fumbling as he followed Tomura, Grinzilla running after them to keep up. Tomura got a ride quickly and got everyone in the car. He'd use Geary to save time, but Miles wouldn't feel comfortable with it given his alignment. Thankfully, there wasn't any traffic, and they got to the nearest mall in record time, at which point he pulled out his lore book, flipping to a blank page, writing a couple of things that he knew needed replaced, like a GI, towels, and the other things that Miles has mentioned. What was in your inventory, Miles? Tomura asked. What? Miles sputtered, looking to be overwhelmed by the whole thing. What were the items in your inventory? We need to replace them, Tomura calmly explained, trying not to scare the youngest member of their party after such a bad experience. Sometimes having a high-level intimidation stat was more of a curse than a boon. Chase, you don't have to dash, Miles tried to protest, but Grinzilla stepped forward. He told me what was in it before we started gathering what was left of his stuff. Grinzilla said, then began listing things off for Tomura. Item list completed. Tomura took them around the mall to get new, higher-quality items for Miles, starting with the clothes since Miles deserved to not be forced to walk around in uncomfortable clothes. Miles stopped protesting rather quickly, and though he was slightly ashamed about the whole thing, he did thank Tomura for doing this for him, promising to pay him back for everything that he was getting him. Tomura shot him a look. You are part of my party. I won't let you suffer from some dickhead's raid on you, kid. Tomura told him, and Miles got teary-eyed and hugged him, shocking him, but Tomura returned the hug. Once they finished gathering better stuff for Miles' inventory, they made sure to drop Miles off at his house after Tomura called for another car for them. What are you planning, Chase? Grinzilla asked as soon as Miles was back in his house and out of earshot. Tomura huffed, glancing at him. Grinzilla rolled his eyes and crossed his arms. I've seen you completely screw over players for saying slurs at us in game. There's no way you're letting this slide. Grinzilla pointed out. Tomura shrugged, his ranger was right, and he showed him the screenshots he took of the NPC's info. Grinzilla stared at them for a moment, then took out his own phone. Do you know that there's a ton of spam services out there that just need a name and phone number to sign up for? Grinzilla commented, already at work typing something at his phone. Tomura blinked, then smirked back at him. Any chance you know how to hack into a person's search history with just a phone number, Zilla? Tomura asked. Grinzilla's eyes narrowed. That, and a whole lot more. Can you give me a clean laptop? Grinzilla replied as they walked down the street. Just let me make some calls, Tomura promised. He would be more than happy to indulge Grinzilla's more violent tendencies, especially if that meant getting some delicious revenge on the little shits that thought they could bully one of his party members. He texted some of his contacts for some clean gear for Grinzilla to use, only for him to notice how uncomfortable Grinzilla looked. Something wrong? Tomura asked with scrutinizing eyes. Just some quirk-based agoraphobia. I'll be fine. Grinzilla brushed off, more focused on up. He was typing on his phone. Tomura frowned but didn't say anything just yet as he looked up whatever the hell agoraphobia was, knowing his party members' debuffs and disadvantages. Frowning when he saw the description of it, he would be asking Grinzilla some questions about what happened to stress him out, but he at least knew why Grinzilla started being chronically online now. He'd need to reevaluate how he treated his party if he didn't realize just how stressed they were and that things like this could happen to his party in the first place. Suddy really loved their first sports festival in person. Quirkus aside, it was a very enjoyable day out for them. Having something they and Fumi could actually experience together for the first time was rare, since they had to play their part of being a quirk for so long. And the sports festival was pretty fun. Izuku's friends were all very friendly, and they didn't seem that bothered by Bakuga's attitude, and they might be able to share their love of sparkly cute things with Uraraka. She seemed to like the sparkly panda that the both of them gave her. And now they were all heading off to a local mutation shop, so unfortunately, they had to go back to hiding away inside of Fumi, which was a bummer. They couldn't keep talking like they were in the booth at the festival, having to rely on Fumi to tell the others their comments and replies. And they couldn't see everything as clearly from inside their little space. When they did look outside, it was all black and white outlines, which they didn't like because they couldn't see any of the bright and pretty colors. But they put up with it, and at the very least they could hear fairly well what was being said without Fumi's body getting in the way. But once they got to the shop, they popped back out and stayed on Fumi's shoulder, making sure to stay as small as a mouse. Uraraka's eyes lighting up when she spotted them, and they gave her a wave. Oh, Cammy, that is so cute. Uraraka whispered, trying not to draw everyone's attention. Can I? She asked, her hand hovering over Suddy, clearly wanting to pet them. Yes. Suddy chirped, thrilled at the idea of being stroked by the little finger beans on Uraraka's hands. They wanted to play with her hand beans, but were scared that it would sound weird. Uraraka eagerly pet them, and it felt amazing. They couldn't help chirping from the delightful sensations until Fumi stopped them. Apologizes, but I'd rather us not draw attention, Fumi told them, And while they were sad about the lack of pets, the both of them understood. Sorry, Uraraka said, not offended as she waved her hands. So, what should we get? I haven't been to one of these places before. Aways asked, looking around the place. Considering Aways wasn't a mutant or a half-transformation quirk, Suddy could believe he hadn't been in one before. Well, it depends on the store. Most of them tend to carry live prey and are geared towards animal-quirked individuals' needs. Fumi answered. Live prey? Uraraka asked cautiously, and a touch green as her eyes went over to where the aisle with the animal cages were. Yes, predator-quirked individuals often have the longing for fresh meat. Some even prefer to chase their prey too. Fumi explained, walking over to the selection, and Suddy hoped he would be getting some more mice for them. Wow, people really do that. I couldn't imagine trying to eat something while it was still kicking. Aways told them, his face twisted into discomfort at the thought. Shoji shrugged. My mom eats live stuff sometimes, mostly bugs because it makes her feel better. I've tried them too, and have been eating them more since it helps me make my scales, but I prefer the dead stuff instead. Shoji admitted. Were you scared they'd bite your throat, Gigi? Uraraka questioned, concerned, and they, Shoji, and Fumi looked at her. No. I've never thought about that before. I just didn't like how they squirmed when they were alive. Shoji replied. Us too. Suddy piped in, with Fumi nodding. Maybe it's an animal quirk thing. SHD like that might not occur to you guys. Aways suggested. We could ask Mito-kun about it later. Shoji offered as he grabbed 2 buckets of crickets, one live and the other not. Do they at least taste good? Uraraka inquired, even though she looked uneasily at the buckets. My taste buds probably take after mom's, but these crickets taste like almond smoked shrimp to me. Shoji informed her, a bit shy about this, which Uraraka must have noticed. That's great, Gigi. She responded with a little more cheer and trying strong to push aside her discomfort. Where do they even get all these animals? Aways asked, staring at the cage of rabbits. Most are from shitty farms that breed them. The places that get the F-airs wild have to label them as feral for customer safety and get them checked for rabies beforehand. Bakuga said for them. Oh, like cows and chickens? Cool. I think I can dig that life. Aways replied, somewhat amused. What do you and Suddy like to eat? Shoji inquired. We like rodents. Mostly mice, but we've had snake with our moms too. Suddy answered cheerfully. In a soup. Snake soup is a traditional dish in our family. Fumi added quickly, seeing the way Uraraka paled. Bakuga hummed. Had that once, some crappy restaurant the hag dragged us all to. The soup was lame though. The pussies didn't leave the skull or any of the other bones in it, he commented. They didn't. But the bones are the best part of the soup. Suddy gasped, offended by the idea. The marrow in them make the broth taste so much better. Suddy insisted, but Fumi placed a hand on them. Asterisk, Suddy, not so loud. Asterisk, Fumi told them, and they apologized right away. Bakuga huffed. Then you better get your hags to make it for us next time I'm over for supper. Bakuga said, and Suddy had to resist the urge to hug him for saying that. Because they very much wanted to share the family dish with Bakuga, they knew that Fumi would be happy to share it with Bakuga too from how ruffled his feathers got. I'll make sure to inform them of your wish, Bakuga. Fumi replied, shifting his feet, and then tried to distract himself by opening one of the freezers on the bottom to fetch some more mice. Live prey aside, what else is here? Aways asked as they moved out of the prey section. Well, there is also enrichment toys and special care products for the care of our additional features, like the milk soap Mother and I need for our feathers. Fumi commented. Bakuga huffed. The old man also gets our SHD in places like this. The blonde mentioned, getting a few surprised looks from the others. Oh, because you and your dad sweat chemicals and stuff. Suddy guessed, and Bakuga nodded. Yeah, we'd be a pair of walking biohazards if we didn't get the right SHD to neutralize the CRP that comes out of our pores. Bakuga confirmed, stopping to grab some of the Miss Lemon's baking soda laundry beads. Uraraka checked the price tags and her mouth almost dropped. Whoa, these cost so much, she commented. They're specially developed for F-airs like me. Of course, it's going to cost more than the off-brand CRP you use Newton F, or since it's got a bunch of SHD in it, normal cleaners don't. Bakuga said, rolling his eyes. Oh, right. Uraraka sputtered, rushing over to the next aisle. That just so happened to be the toy aisle. This is my favorite aisle. Suddy exclaimed, they eyes locked on some of the sparkly marbles in the assorted buckets. I can see why. Aways replied, busy looking through the various toys with a curious eye before taking off one of the chew toys and squeezed it, making it light up. This is a cool stress ball. Aways commented. That's a chew toy, Awakuan. Shoji pointed out, though Aways waved him off. Chew toy, stress ball, same thing, different name. Aways replied, keeping it and likely planning to buy it for himself. But Suddy saw something that made their eyes pop, and they gasped. Fumi. 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 They whispered, tugging on his collar. He pointed to one of the marble bins. Look, they squealed. The marbles in the bin they pointed out were clear, with a yellow fuzzy thing in the middle and red glitter scattered inside of them. We need those, Suddy stated, and knew that Fumi was just as entranced by the marbles as he squatted down to the bin of starburst marbles. Fumi scooping up a small handful, and the two of them just stared at them. Do you want those, guys? Uraraka questioned, leaning down to see what they had. Yes, Fumi answered for them both. Then put them into this bag. They're only like 30 yen a piece, so we can buy a bunch. Do you want any other marbles? Uraraka asked, looking around at the other marbles as she held open one of the small plastic bags available in the aisle. Uraraka, you don't have to dash, Fumi tried to tell her, but Uraraka just took the marbles out of his hands and into the bag herself. It's fine, and please just call me Yukai. You got us a bunch of marbles too, so it's only fair we get you some. Uraraka dismissed, waving a hand. Now show me which ones you both want. Uraraka insisted. Suddy smiled, switching shoulders to point out the chrome-looking ones, with Fumi reluctantly trailing along and picking a few out himself, but keeping the starburst marbles as the biggest collective of the marbles. Another few minutes, and they were all checked out, and were just sort of walking around following Bakuga's lead since he knew the area the best, leading them to some less traveled places that let Suddy stay out, and curled up on Fumi's shoulder. So how did you guys meet Bakuga? Uraraka asked, fiddling the scented necklace she got at the shop. Bakuga came to our aid one morning during school. Fumi answered. Really? Aways asked in, between licking at the popsicle he grabbed last minute. Uh-huh. The punks that locked Fumi and I in a closet tried to corner Fumi, and then Bakuga showed up and got us away from those jerks. Suddy gleefully recounted, jumping over to Bakuga to hug him. Bakuga sked, shut it potty. That CRP didn't mean SHD, Bakuga spat. Suddy dead. Sure it wasn't, and those gifts you made for us were just made because you felt bad about the closet thing. Suddy teased, nipping at Bakuga's ear, making Bakuga jump. I will use my quirk on you if you don't shut up, you second-rate Muppet. Bakuga growled back, pink dusting his cheeks. They laughed and hugged him, not minding Bakuga grumbling death threats to them. Asterisk Suddy. Asterisk Fumi said warningly, and Suddy stuck their tongue out back at him mentally. Bakuga had truly grown on them, both them and Fumi. And sure, they didn't know which way Bakuga swung, or even if he was interested in being with two people at once. But they would hardly figure it out if they didn't at least try to sniff things out and maybe drop some hints of being open to something like that in the first place. They and Fumi probably wouldn't be able to find someone with a quirk like theirs, and even less of a chance they'd both like said people in the first place. And they both kind of accepted they likely wouldn't find anyone PRD. Then Bakuga came rocking into their lives, bearing glittery gifts and gritted teeth that made them feel all safe inside. And while Fumi wasn't as keen as they were in the beginning about him, Fumi couldn't resist him for long. How could they both not fall for him when he was taller than both of them and had such bright, strong colors? And Bakuga was so protective of them in and out of school. Bakuga even constantly showered them both with gifts, so even if they tried to drown out their combined instincts, Bakuga just seemed to ruffle their feathers in the right way. So, if there was some slim chance that they could maybe get Bakuga to like them and Fumi back, then sure as hell Suddy was going to try and woo him for them both. Don't ignore me, Potty. I'm talking to you. Bakuga snapped, trying to push them off of him. And they turned their attention back to Bakuga's ranting. It really was cute how huffy Bakuga got when they weren't being affectionate with him, kind of like a cat, but without the claws. Toshinori sat on his bed, his hands clenched. Squirming on the inside as he glanced back at his pillow, his anxiety grew. His meeting with Nizu had taken quite a few turns he hadn't thought would happen, mainly due to the young boy that was at the meeting. Young Midoriya had certainly given him a lot to mull over as he ate his final meal of the day. His quirk wasn't just one quirk, and he had only survived wielding it as long as he had, because he didn't have one before now. And even more damningly, he learned that young Tenko was still alive and in such a dangerous place, but that wasn't even the worst thing he learned today. Toshinori took a deep breath, and he glanced out the window. Because for all these years, the odd dreams he always did his best to shrug off weren't as benign as he thought. That thought made his throat dry. How could it not when it meant that he had been completely ignoring his MS-her, not haunted by her memory, like he assumed he was before? Something that opened up a whole can of worms in the form of questions. Just how aware were the echoes of the past wielders? Could they see what was happening and going on around him? Could they still see the world through his eyes? Or what about seeing his other memories? Here are his thoughts. He wanted to ask young Midoriya these things, but the boy had admitted he didn't know much about the dynamics of quirks like One for All, which Toshinori figured was fair enough. He wasn't an expert in quirks, and he clearly didn't understand the quirk he had and used daily for so many years now on even a basic level. And now he was faced with a difficult task ahead of him, going to sleep. Toshinori snorted at that thought, his gaze going up to the ceiling. Most people would be excited to do that, but he now had a lot of doubts and new feelings about the things he had been doing ever since he was born. Because this time, when he went to sleep, it would not be the dread he recently had come to know, but anxiety as he was to be reunited with his Nana, someone he'd missed quite so dearly over the years. Though he was just as scared by the idea, would she be angry with him? Frankly, how could she not be cross with him? He'd failed to keep her family safe after she passed, and when they did get attacked, he hadn't bothered to even make sure that they were dead, and poor little Tenko was now in the hands of that horrid man. Then there was his fight with said monster, the one that almost killed him, and yet he couldn't even actually kill him, fulfilling his one duty as a wielder and naively let all for one work in the shadows once he faked his death. And now that he did know there was nothing that he could do about it, because he was so reckless that his body couldn't properly recover after the fight, leaving him the shambling pile of bones that would have to pass this duty on to some other poor soul that would be in worlds of pain and danger simply because of his own selfish desires and whims. Young Midoriya's coldly furious eyes flashed through his mind as the boy's words repeated once again. No matter how much that quirk was your blessing, it won't be mine. You might have turned your back on who you were before you took inheritance Yagi, but I've used it to help people. It was a very sharp dig at him, but one he supposed was well-deserved. Because young Midoriya was right in the end. One for All truly was his greatest blessing, letting him pass as a regular human with his own quirk. And he'd even gone out of his way to actively bury his connections to his past in just about every shape and form, with only Torino-sensei being any the wiser before the boy called him out. He'd donate money to the charities for the quirkless, but that was hardly the support they needed, and he did remember those times back before he got One for All, of how he lived for those 5 years after he was kicked out of the orphanage, on his own and working whatever jobs he could get just to afford food and rent in his old apartment. It was such an awful time for him, and he hated thinking about how alone he was back then or how he even came to be in that situation in the first place. How long had it been since he visited his mother's grave? Not since Nana passed away. It was too dangerous before, but he really hadn't had any excuse after that. He hadn't had many years with her, but Toshinori remembered how strong she had to work just to keep a roof over his head and how kind she was to him despite everything going wrong for her. It was why he attached himself to Nana. She reminded him so much of his mother before she had gotten so sick. He should make some plans to visit her grave later, and maybe Nana's as well. Toshinori sighed, dragging one of his hands down his face, as another wave of guilt nipped at him in addition to all of the guilt young Midoriya had placed upon him. But as he forced himself to lay down on his bed, he couldn't help being more consumed by his other fear. Because as much as he feared her hatred of him, something that would truly break his heart, he feared the opposite even more. If she didn't hate him, then there could be only one of two reasons for that. Either she didn't know what was happening in the world around him, in which case he'd have to be the one to explain everything to her and break her heart in person, or she wouldn't be Nana. Young Midoriya had said echoes could be different things, and the likelihood of the echo actually being Nana and not just a vestige of her was far more likely than he truly wanted to admit to himself. And the thought of a phony version of Nana sitting in his head made him feel rather uncomfortable, because that ghost would never truly be her, and just another thing to taunt him for his failures. Sleep, like on many a night before this, did not come to him willingly. For after hours of his mind running itself into the ground over every possible scenario, his tired and aching body sunk its claws into him, and his eyes slid shut, not to open again for quite a while. Opening his eyes, Toshinori tensed as he found himself sitting at the table of his old apartment once again. He looked over to the door and waited. There was a silence that had never came before, long and drawn out. Nana had always begun dreams like this, pleading with him to open the door, or if it was the other man, then he'd wait a few seconds before he too began to call for him. Was he mistaken? A consideration that made his heart drop. What if young Midoriya was right, and he wasn't truly connected with One for All, because he was quirkless, and this dream was just some godforsaken nightmare he'd keep having until he took his last breath? Toshinori's head whipped up towards the door. "Toshi, please answer me," Nana pleaded. And this time, with tears welling in his eyes, he finally answered her. Toshinori's voice cracked. And perhaps it was just because of how emotional he was at the moment. But how was he supposed to really keep himself together in a time like this? "Toshi," Nana exclaimed, and Toshinori knew even without seeing her that Nana had to be crying as she said it, her voice also being choked up from how happy she sounded. "Nana," Toshinori repeated, dumbly unable to think of what to say next. "Yes, Toshi, it's me, I swear." Nana excitedly told him, "I'm not a fake. It's the real me, Toshi," she proclaimed. "You dash," Toshinori sputtered. "We can see what you see since I passed you the quirk," Nana told him, her excitement dipping to a much more somber tone. Toshinori clenched his hands and waited for the hate to surface. "But please, Toshi, I don't hate you. Not for my mistake," Nana insisted, and Toshinori shook his head. It wasn't her fault that he was so blind and moronic to all for one's plans and schemes, or didn't even give it enough thought to realize he was being played before it was literally forced into his face. "Toshinori, I made you promise to leave Kotaro alone, thinking it would keep him safe from that BSTRD, and I was wrong," Nana said sternly before he heard her sharply inhale. "He's dead because I foolishly thought I could protect him by cutting all ties between us, but I was wrong, Toshi, and he's dead," Nana yelled, the sound of her fists hitting the door, but it not budging as she shouted the last word. "And it all my fault?" Nana managed to say between her sobs. Toshinori's heart leapt to his throat, and tears fell down his face. "No, it wasn't. You were just doing what you thought was best." He tried to argue. "No, I didn't," Nana screamed back with another bang on the door, forcing Toshinori flinch back, only able to stare wide-eyed at the door. "Sorahiko tried to reason with me and told me how stupid I was being by thinking I could just send my son away and think that BSDRD would really leave him alone. But I didn't listen, and there was no one there to save Kotaro or his family because I was too demon stubborn to listen," Nana told him as she broke down on the other side of the door. "Nana," Toshinori said as he got to his feet, wanting to rush to her side to comfort her. "I messed up, Toshinori, so please don't blame yourself for the mistake I made," Nana begged. Toshinori's feet were moving before he even think, and he was fast at work undoing the dozens of self-made locks he created to keep people out back when he was living here. Nana tried to speak but stopped as the door was opened. Suddenly, now that the door was open, the world felt different. The wood of the door more solid, and the chill of the metal locks on his skin where it wasn't before. And standing right in front of him was Nana. She was younger than he remembered, but it was absolutely Nana, clearly having been crying her eyes out, but he'd never mistake her for anyone. Nana's breath hitched, fear of him not actually being in front of her easily read on her face as they both stared at each other. Then she wrapped her arms around him, and he buried his face in her shoulder, the two of them collapsing against each other and ended up hugging each other on their knees, holding on and crying, both scared to let go in fear of the other disappearing. Then, after what felt like an entirety, later the tears calmed down, though he wasn't quite ready to let go, yet allowed Nana to put some space between them, and both looked at each other once again. Her eyes still red, but she smiled at him all the same as she took his face in her hands. Toshinori, I'm late in saying this, but I know Noelle would be so proud of how far you've come and what you've done, Nana told him. Toshinori felt his breath being stolen from him, a new wave of tears falling from his eyes, and he again hugged Nana. It had been decades since he heard anyone talk about his mother, much less say her name, and to have Nana say that she was proud of him. Well, Toshinori would need a moment to collect himself. Atsuhiro's side, SWNGNG, one of his legs that were dangling off the edge of the roof he was sitting upon. Night watches were a very boring affair, but he could hardly argue the necessity of them either, especially not after such a brilliant showing at the festival earlier. Atsuhiro grinned at the thought, twirling the marbles in his hand. His sweet little charge had certainly gotten the eyes of so many people. Oh, and that lovely leading lady of the event, Miss Haku, was such a lovely co-host for him. The boy needed more people in his corner, especially those that could publicly stand up for him. Alas, he and a great many of Deku's most devoted followers would, sadly, never be able to tell others of Deku's greatest feats. Such a shame, a pity really. But on the other hand, he couldn't say he was truly upset with Deku's name not being that widespread just yet. Let him continue on as he was helping those that truly needed just a hand, helping those that fell through the cracks. Greed had a way of ruining people, whether by corrupting someone directly or poisoning those around them. He'd seen his fair share of greed over the years, having stolen from all kinds of people, mainly heroes of course. Some of his family had been tainted by it as well, but Atsuhiro's point still stood. Deku seemed to be immune to the temptations of the sin of indulgence. He had more money than he, or his family, had ever stolen collectively and never touched more than a fraction of that money for himself. Others, though, Atsuhiro glanced at the 3 marbles he was twirling in his hand with narrowed eyes. For in these marbles weren't the supplies that he'd recently been moving for Deku, nor the weapons he constantly carried on his person since he was hired. No, each marble held a rotten person. It wasn't the first time that he's caught someone trying to sneak up on his charge. It happened once in a blue moon, what with his numerous connections, keeping a large chunk of the nefarious types away. However, there was always that one poor fool that tried their luck. They used to be dealt with by the Vespas, but he'd taken over that job after he was hired. Tonight, though Miss Haku had unintentionally kicked the hornet's nest with her speech, leading there to be more foolishly brave idiots to try their luck and attempt to attack Deku. Not that they got close enough to try. Speaking of which, Atsuhiro leapt off the building and with the practiced ease hopped over to the neighboring apartment building roof, down the fire escape, and slapped a hand on a man hiding in the shadows. Imagining the man condensing, and then in a snap the man was gone, and he grabbed the marble he was held inside of out of the air. This marble would make 4 people he held captive, 2 more, and he'd break his previous record of people caught in one night. Atsuhiro slipped the marble in a hidden pocket and quickly made his way back to the rooftops, then headed back to where he originally was, sitting on the edge of the roof and twirling a couple of marbles in one hand. Come the end of the night, he would hand all of the people he caught over to the Vespas. They would deal with the people accordingly from there. And if those people were never seen or heard from again, well, he understood it was best that a magician never reveals his tricks, and he never asked what happened to the people he made disappear. Atsuhiro could only hope that the Vespas at least got some information out of the people he gave them. For now, though, he'd focus on his current act and watch over his charges home, and ensure that both he and the angel of a woman that was his mother were safe and sound as they slept. The hours dragged on with only the occasional interruption in the form of a person sneaking around and trying to break into Deku's home. A rather dull way to pass the time, even with the increase in people showing up to harm the boy and his mother. Until it was halfway through the night when a Vespa came to bring him some food. Esme, he remembered, most of the Vespas tended to blur in his memory, what with how many of them there were. But Esme had stuck out, tall for a Vespa at 4'8", and on the more rabbit than human side of the mutation scale, and the most adorable smile he's seen in years. And she seemed to share his interest in magic too, truly a woman after his own heart, if there ever was one. Esme, dear, how lovely to see you again, he greeted with a twist of his hand, and a small bundle of flowers were in his hand, offered to the young lady. Robin, she said, trying to be admonishing but failed. showing just how amused she was from her smile. The young woman slipped into his side, easily handing off the bento box to him so she could play with one of the flowers he gave her. Atsuhiro, on the other hand, moved his mask and began eating, finding the rice molded into little rabbits popping out of top hat-shaped wraps on the inside. Asterisk how cute. Asterisk Atsuhiro couldn't help thinking before he took his first bite. He enjoyed the brief moment of serenity, as it held its own sort of magic. Sitting on a roof in the middle of the night with a lovely woman beside him, surrounded by the glimmering lights of the city and the full moon shining brightly above them. Yes, he'd be sure to treasure this calm in the years to come. With the threat of all for one rising, it was likely that such moments would soon be stolen from him, and everyone else for that matter. "Hey, Robin," Esme called, and he hummed back in acknowledgement. "Does it ever scare you, knowing that there's someone like he who takes out there, just existing?" she asked him. Atsuhiro took a moment to consider the question. "Very much, yes. Frankly, it's terrifying," he replied honestly. "It's kind of suffocating, right? I don't know what will kill me first, one of his monsters or the anxiety of waiting for him to strike." She morosely told him, her head leaning on his chest. "Worry not, my dear. We are both in good hands," Atsuhiro assured, bringing one of his hands up to slide her head. "Between your family, Morozov, and Deku, I doubt there could be anything that could lay a finger on us," he mused, taking one of her hands and kissing it like a gentleman. She snorted. "Don't be so corny," she told him, putting one of her paw-like hands on his face to make him turn away from her. "Oh, you wound, my dear. Don't you know that my corniness is my best asset?" Atsuhiro teased, bringing his hand up to his forehead dramatically. Esme giggled, taking the empty bento box, and stood up. "I thought that brain of yours was your best asset," she joked, and he hummed. "I suppose you're right, but it is a close second, no?" Atsuhiro asked, and that time she smacked him playfully on the shoulder. Esme giggling the whole way as she leapt away, easily disappearing from sight with her jet-black fur. Atsuhiro watched her go for another second, then turned back to the apartments, knowing that the Vespas that were temporarily watching for him wouldn't be sticking around for long. The local branch of the family were probably aware of the two of them fancying each other by this point, not that they gave him leeway for it. If anything, he was held to a higher quality of work since he was getting closer to being family. Not that he could see a problem with that. Becoming a Vespa would hardly be the worst thing in the world. He had already strayed from the straight and narrow when he took to crime years and years ago, so joining a criminal family wasn't something he was opposed to, and Esme certainly seemed like someone worth spending his life with. He could picture her now even. Years down the line, they'd have a house or an apartment on the family compound, maybe a few dozen kids running around since the Vespa woman had litters. Not that he'd mind that either, since he liked a big family and could pay to take care of that many children. The only thing that stood in the way of that happy little life, though, was all for one. Though hopefully he would become a non-issue soon with Deku's plans in mind. Hearing a pair of boots moving in the background, Atsuhiro leapt down and pressed against a wall, hiding in the shadows and looking up. A hero, a younger one, landed on the rooftop he was just on and scanned the area. He didn't recognize the person and figured it was a newbie added to the rotation, waiting for a moment, then moved on with their patrol. Asterisk how odd. Asterisk Atsuhiro thought. Heroes patrol nicer areas like this, sure, but they typically skip this part most days. Not like crime happened here very often. Hopefully the Vespas would get to the bottom of this. As nice as it would be for people to be more concerned about people, he understood that heroes weren't that nice. A change in the rotation would have come from on high, most likely from the commission or someone equally powerful to get the underground to listen. They were creatures of habit and didn't like changes in their work schedule. So as much as he'd like to believe Nizu pulled some strings because he was worried about Deku, it wasn't likely he held enough sway to ask them of that and get them to react the same day. Atsuhiro waited for another few minutes until he was sure they were gone, then climbed back to his perch and watched over the apartment block once again, though he made sure not to let his mind wander. If there was going to be more than one hero showing up that night, he couldn't let his mind wander. He didn't like the idea of his new costume being assumed as a criminal's. Deku had put a lot of work into it and managed to keep some of the original elements of his former costume. Deku could make him a better one, but he'd prefer keeping this one. Thank you very much. Atsuhiro looked over the rooftop for any new bugs before he settled down, No point in getting caught by the HPSC and proving that Deku was involved in any illegal activity, and therefore leverage for them to manipulate Deku. As the appointed bodyguard, it wouldn't do him well to make trouble for his charge by being lazy. Morozov would have his head for it if the other groups didn't get to him first. Thankfully, he'd never let that happen. He understood that his job was a very important one. Deku needed to be protected, and that currently fell to him to ensure the boy's physical safety. His watch would be over soon, though. Only so much sleep he could cut out and still act like a functioning member of society. He didn't remember the name of the Vespa that would relieve him, but he did know what they could do, and that his quirk's effect on people seemed tame in comparison. And right on K, 2 hours later the scrappy rabbit man came and grunted at him to leave. He didn't need to tell him twice. The drop-off of the people he caught was a couple hours away, and he'd like to eat something else before bed tonight. Yuichi, while very happy for Nana and Eighth being reunited, felt awkward watching the two and turned away from them and walked back to the common area, glad the pathway had finally been made solid. It took a lot out of him to rebuild a path that Eighth's mind consistently tore through. It was another reason for why the others stopped coming around. Eighth's mind was strong, and he was constantly trying to force them out. Doing that was draining on them, and they always needed to hide away in their own pockets to regather themselves. Even Nana had to do that. But now that Eighth was aware of them and opened himself up, that should clear up, even if they couldn't visit Eighth in person with how little time Eighth would have left with them. Reaching the common area, he found the other 5 waiting for him. Well, did Blondie finally answer? Or is he still burying his head in the sand? Second asked. Eighth and Nana are together right now. I'm not sure if they'll join us yet, though. They haven't seen each other in years. Yuichi replied, getting a few sighs from the other members. I suppose it would only make sense. Nana was much closer with the boy than any of us were. In mused, no offense, Yuichi, he added after a moment, but he quickly brushed the thought aside. And was right. While everyone had chosen their successor on some level or another, none of them were as close as Nana and Eighth were. He looked up to Second, but they weren't quite friends until after so many years of being trapped here. They just were. Second and Bruce grew close in the fight against his brother, and have remained so, but that was in a time where they could only rely on themselves and their allies. Nana, on the other hand, took on a very familial role in Eighth's life. They could see that much when Nana was still alive. The exact details have been blurred for them since Nana passed the quirk on, but Nana's worry for him was impossible to hide for long. Second sked, well, I'm not going to wait for the numb nuts to join us to talk about what Junior was blabbering about. He told the group, and Yuichi couldn't help getting flustered at that remark. Midoriya Izuku admittedly bore a striking resemblance to him when he was younger, if he was healthier and had green hair, but other than those 2 things they looked super close, and frankly he wasn't certain that Midoriya wasn't related to him in some way. And if that wasn't enough, everyone had seen his memories of when he was little and how he used to be obsessed with working out how superhero powers from comics worked. So even if they weren't exactly the same personality-wise, they were both quirk nerds. What's there to discuss? Junior didn't tell us anything we didn't already know. Banjo said dismissively. How about the fact he actually had a explanation for how I died, you idiot? For why each of us were losing it near the end of our lives. Hikage spat back, which was true. Banjo had read the report, and the coroner hadn't really seen anything like it before, and the only thing they could come up with was quirk-based advance aging. But the mental and physical destruction of the body made more sense in the context Midoriya had given them. The brain's neurons would burn themselves out trying to keep this quirk space, and that was probably too much to handle on a brain focus for one type of quirk. And the rest of the body would go to hell if the brain was damaged. It had to be focused on the pituitary gland, though, to cause most of the aging problems in the body. And he could believe that since each body would produce different levels of hormones because of their quirks, Bruce began snapping his fingers in front Yuichi's face. Hey, first stay with us. No running off in one of those quirk rambles. Bruce scolded. Right, sorry. Yuichi apologized. We already knew about the damage. Strong not to when we could see the degeneration in person. Banjo countered. Also a fact, the degeneration was slower before, because there weren't that many quirks and they weren't that far removed from the quirkless generation, so their bodies weren't as specialized yet. But it was still seen by them all. Taking risks they normally wouldn't, harder for them to take in more information, and even having a harder time recalling things they used to know. memories that just seemed to slip away from them and were replaced with those of the past holders. Bruce forgot he'd grown up in America and was certain he lived where Second had until he died himself, and joined them in the quirk space and remembered it all. Eighth had remained unaffected by it for the longest out of all of them, and when it did start, it was progressing at a much slower rate compared to everyone else. Eighth was still aware of who he was before and could understand new things in moderation. And physically, there were almost no signs of the collective quirks hurting his body like it had any of the others. But now we aren't just assuming CRP, and can find ways to reverse or halt the damage, you knucklehead. Hikage argued. Second nodded. Fourth is right. Now that we know the exact details of the problem, we can plan with Eighth around it to find a successor that will have the worst of it mediated in some way. Second concurred, both hands on the war table that appeared, Second being just behind him in making things appear in the space. A quirkless person is preferable, even without juniors say, so Eighth is proof that a quirkless successor will last longer and not add to the burden of the multiple quirks. Bruce pointed out, easily falling in step with Second. But it would be strong to find someone with the right mindset in this day and age. If how Eighth feels is any comparison, then we can expect most of them being self-defeatist at best, and that wouldn't work well with the strength quirk. Second said with a frown, getting a nod from Bruce. Oh, don't get ahead of yourselves, you crazy old bastards. Banjo shouted, and the three ended up in one of their typical fights, Hikage raising to try and break up the fight between the first hero and the villains as normal. Taking the moment, Yuchi slipped away to a more distant part of the shared space, where the road looked out over a large chasm of space, and he sat down and took a deep breath before sighing. The calm letting his mind fall blank. Something rare since coming to this space, his grip of himself felt much less solid when something like this happened, letting dozens of memories, his own and the others, flow in and out as they pleased. The peace was short-lived as another person approached, and silently walking over and sitting beside him on the edge of the landscape, not looking at him. I suppose that today has left you with a lot to think about. In commented, and Yuchi nodded. There was the overarching problems that the others were currently fighting about, but there were the other things that made him feel more existential, such as they themselves living in this quirk space. Yuchi had first thought of himself as a ghost when he woke up here. He remembered the pain of dying and even his last moments, his hand going up to his upper chest where the spike of rebar that jutted through him had stuck out. Barely able to breathe as his lungs filled with his BLD, coughing it up in equal measure and aware he was dying. His already failing health would have made him surviving this near impossible even if they did get him out. Second had been the one to find him in the collapsed building and sat with him once he realized that Yuchi was going to pass soon. Yuchi could even remember how warm Second's hand felt when he held hands with him until he passed, and that he'd spent his last minutes wishing there was some way for him to give Second the strength his brother forced onto him. It was only after Second passed the quirk on to Bruce that they realized this was probably a result of his secret quirk and began questioning whether they were ghosts or not. Each of them could recall their deaths in vivid detail, so he didn't think they were just memories or impressions of who they used to be. Memories wouldn't have their own sense of agency either. This field of quirks likely wasn't that well explored, and the only expert would probably be his brother. Who knows, his quirk might not just be a quirk collector, but a soul hoarder too for all they knew. So, what do you think is troubling you more? The idea we might not be quite as real as we think we are, or the fact we've been closer to killing your brother than ever before? And asked after letting him stew for a moment. Yuchi clenched his hands and hung his head. The second, he confessed, feeling dirty and guilty for admitting it like he was. He should be glad. He knew the kind of monster his brother was, having watched him twist and hurt people in so many ways over the centuries. It's okay to feel that way, and told him, placing his hand on Yuchi's shoulder, and was one of the few of them that was more in touch with his feelings, and considerably more friendly than the other wielders. Bar Nana, though, for all the compassion she held, he wouldn't dare think he'd ever ask her to sympathize with him in this regard. And this was just another reason that En was more compassionate than the others. While Yuchi was alive, it was harder to understand how horrid and manipulative his brother was even before the rise of the Meta Army. Only in death and the others' comments for centuries did Yuchi truly come to terms with it. But even though En had arguably died the worst death at the hands of his brother out of all of them, he still found it in himself to privately offer him support over the eventual loss of his brother. En huffed amused, "Well, I'm glad you think so highly of me, Yuchi, but we're both human, and I know that even with everything that's gone down between us and him, he is still your brother somewhere in your heart," and told him, pulling down where his coat hit his mouth, so Yuchi could see his sad smile. Yuchi returned it as tears welled up. "I know the whole reason we've been fighting is to stop him, permanently and for good, but after centuries of trying and failing, I don't know. It felt like he'd never actually be gone," Yuchi said somberly, fumbling to find the right words. En nodded, urging him to continue on. "And now, after having it laid out so clearly, and how easy it would be to be rid of him forever, Yuchi trailed off as he became more choked up, and didn't say anything, and gently pulled him over to lean his head on his shoulder, and allowing him to cry quietly into his shoulder while rubbing his back. Yuchi, filled with mourning that had been pushed off, sorrow and guilt eating him up from the inside out in equal measure, knowing that he might soon have his brother no longer be a part of his life, even as an antagonist, brought on some deep form of sadness over him and made him choked up to think about. But he also felt guilty about that, because his brother was someone that tormented him and the closest people he had in his life. Hell, Yuchi remembered when Nana came home to what remained of her husband laid splayed on their shared bed, and couldn't believe his brother could truly be that cruel as to use what was left of her family to continue to torture them all. There was even days he hated his older brother, and yet he couldn't stop himself from mourning his eventual death. "Let it all out, Yuchi, go on, it's okay to cry," and assured him, running one of his hands through Yuchi's hair while the other remained firm on his back, offering Yuchi a sense of security as both emotions warred inside of him. Thank you for joining us on this journey through What If Villain Deku Became a Teacher at U.A. We hope you found it as captivating as we did. A big thank you to Bloomerbill for creating such an engaging story. Don't forget to visit their profile on fanfiction.net for more fantastic works. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more intriguing explorations into fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we love hearing your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section. See you soon in the next video.